We would like to welcome you guys to today's webinar titled Counteracting a Ransomware Attack, What You Need to Know. My name is Stephanie and I'll be your host today. This session will take a close look at the ransomware kill chain. We'll also discuss how to detect ransomware behavior in your corporate environment and how you can use response automation to counteract an attack. Before I introduce our featured speakers, let's review a few housekeeping items. You've joined today's webinar listening through your computer speaker system by default. If you would like to call in using the phone, click the caret next to the mute button in the bottom control panel. Click Audio Options, Join by Phone. The dial-in information and access code will then be displayed. You also can ask questions using the Q&A pane in the lower control panel. Simply type in your question and click Send. At the end of the presentation, we will do a Q&A session and take as many questions as we have time for. The recording of today's webinar will be available 48 hours after the live event. Look for an email from us on Friday. Okay, enough with housekeeping. Let's welcome in today's speaker, Orion Cassetto. Orion is the Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Exabeam. He has nearly a decade of experience marketing cybersecurity and web application security products. Prior to Exabeam, Orion worked for other notable security vendors, including Imperva, Encapsula, and Distill Networks, as well as Armorize Technologies. He is a security enthusiast and frequent speaker at conferences and trade shows. Welcome, Orion.
Thank you, Stephanie.
And with that said, I would like to turn it over to Orion to kick things off. Orion?
All right. So the goal here is to talk about ransomware. So we'll start with what is ransomware. Ransomware essentially is kidnapping, but the digital version. It's kidnapping data. It is a type of malware that goes into a system, it finds sensitive data, and then encrypts it, and then demands payment in order to get a decryption key. So very similar to, physical kidnapping, but for data. A little bit about trends in the ransomware world. So what you're looking at here is from Google Trends. We're looking at the search term for ransomware over time. It shows about the last year. What you can see is, first off, right now ransomware is a very, very hot topic. You can see the WannaCry news over the last week. You can also see there's a small bump, basically quarterly for the last year. Those were ransomware outbreaks, but they're very much dwarfed by the WannaCry incident. A little bit of note on our research. So we actually did some research about this time last year. The interesting thing is what we did was in the May through July 2016 time frame, we did research on ransomware. We took several different ransomware specimens, including Locky. We dissected them and we looked at how they behaved. The reason that I bring that up is that, while that research is a year ago and it was backward looking, because we were looking at how ransomware behaves, we were able to look at that same research and compare it to, newer strains of ransomware like, Flipper, Crisis, Decryption, and even WannaCry. And what we found is that because ransomware has the same end game, it has the same shared behavior, and the research ended up being forward looking as well. So I want to talk a little bit more about that research. As I said, it was about a year ago in the May through July timeframe. What we did was we took 86 strains of malware and we detonated them in a lab. And we were looking at how they behaved. We were collecting artifacts and inspecting them. The lab environment was set up to replicate that of a customer environment. So it included workstations, file servers, domain controllers, and then security products that we could use to gather evidence. The goal here was, in essence, not to look at the nuts and bolts of any specific ransomware, but to instead look at the commonality of behavior of all of this ransomware. What do they, if you look at them, from a life cycle point of view, what commonalities do they share? That led us to develop our ransomware kill chain. So, the basic idea is that because ransomware has the same basic goal, so, kidnap data, encrypt it, and then demand ransom, it has a set of stages that it needs to go through, and then behavior that can be tied to those stages. A quick overview. So the kill chain starts with distribution, and here what it is it's a campaign which could be weaponized websites for drive-by downloads. It could be phishing emails. In essence, it's a vehicle to distribute the malware and to kick off infections with unknowing users. From there, the infection kicks off. And the goal here is to use a very lightweight dropper to kick off a more serious malware infection on the computer. Moving into the staging phase, this is where the malware is trying to establish a foothold into an environment and to be able to persist even through power offs and reboots and whatnot. Next, the malware is going to do a scanning phase where it looks for sensitive files. Then it's going to encrypt those files. Once encryption is complete, you end up at the payday, where it's demanding ransom from its victims. The interesting thing is that this WannaCry malware that's so popular right now conforms to that same pattern of behaviors largely. There are some things that are different about WannaCry. So I want to talk a little bit about why it's a big deal. This webinar is not specific to WannaCry, but because it's so hot right now, I felt like we should touch on it a little bit. First off, ransomware is typically localized. It happens on one machine. One of the big differences between WannaCry and other ransomware is that WannaCry is self-propagating like a worm, and that allows it to spread through networks. Another thing is that it exploits a vulnerability, a software vulnerability, instead of just using social engineering to trick a victim into clicking on a phishing email or unknowingly visiting a weaponized website for a drive-by download. I think the interesting thing about WannaCry is not specifically itself, the fact that it exists, but more the hints that it gives us about the future of what ransomware may look like, using things like more vulnerabilities and exploit kits and less reliance on social engineering and tricking victims. The other thing about it is that it was very public. It was publicized. It was right in the mainstream media's view. And I think the reason is it comes down to two things. So WannaCry combined the effectiveness of infection of a worm with the disruptiveness of ransomware. Typically worms are malware that they spread through a system. They want to infect things and stay silent and quiet so that they can prolong their infection as long as possible, but they're very effective in spreading the infection. WannaCry had those attributes, but it also had the attributes of ransomware, which is very disruptive and very in your face because they need to make their presence known so that they can demand ransom. So I think that really the reason that it was so popular or so publicized is because it had both of those attributes. So I want to dive a little bit into the kill chain at a deeper level. And the reason is that we need to understand what this kill chain looks like so that we can understand the behaviors that we can look for to determine if you have a ransomware infection in your environment. The first stage is distribution. Typically, this is where a user's tricked through social engineering. They're either tricked or forced into downloading a malicious executable or a dropper. This, again, typically comes over a phishing email, a drive-by download, potentially a watering hole attack. The goal is basically to infect the user through trickery. The next stage is infection. So here that dropper that came through the phishing email is going to download an executable. That executable is going to run basically infect the system. It's going to run a malicious file in a local directory. Once that dropper is done, typically they dissolve, they terminate themselves, and the malicious payload is then executed. So the goal here is to install the ransomware on the system. When you get to the staging phase, really what we're looking at here is the goal is to establish persistence, to establish a foothold, a lasting foothold into the victim's computer. So here it's things like eliminating backups. So you can see down in the screenshot, removing shadow copies. During the staging phase, it's also very common for the ransomware to communicate with its command and control center. Goals here might be things like getting a public key or doing further recon, so understanding what is the user in the system that this ransomware is installed in so that they can understand if this is an applicable target or not. Then we move into the scanning phase. The goal of this phase is in essence to understand what sensitive files exist in, both on the local system that the ransomware is running on, but also on network accessible systems. So it's going to scan and map out those locations, figure out what files exist, look for sensitive files. Again, this happens both locally and on network accessible systems. At this phase, it's also very common for variants of ransomware strains to check read and write privileges. Can they write files? Can they delete files? So something that's very important for our coming slides when we discuss looking for behavior. In essence, there is a difference in the amount of time that this stage may take. Now, if you look over on the chart on the right, local scanning can probably take seconds, right? They have immediate access to the files. It can scan through it very, very quickly. What happens is when you start scanning across the network, it can take a larger amount of time. It could take minutes or hours. And the reason is that the ransomware is going to need to look for files. It's going to need to investigate results on the file shares that it's found access to. It's going to need to list out folders and files and to determine if they have the right list, write and delete privileges. The same is true for cloud-based storage. So for cloud-based storage, typically a lot of these are synced as local files, so they appear local to the ransomware. So scanning can happen fairly quickly. But in essence, scanning speed is determined by both network speed and the amount of data and servers that the ransomware needs to scan through. In essence, the bigger the environment, the longer this process is going to take. Moving on to encryption, this is where the damage is actually happening. So the ransomware is going to begin decrypting files. It's going to be looking both, encrypting files for all the things that it discovered. This happens both locally, and it's also going to start encrypting things that it's found throughout the network. For every location where files have been found, encrypted copies are going to be replacing the original copies. The original copies are going to be deleted, and there's going to be an auto-generated ransom note. The goal is that the hacker wants the victim to be discovered, so that way they can pay the ransom to the victim or to the hacker. So some general rules about ransomware encryption. Again, there's a window of opportunity here because encryption takes time. Whereas looking at the chart on the right, local file encryption may happen fairly rapidly. It could take seconds. When you start talking about encrypting files throughout the network, this could take minutes to hours. The idea is that for each file that's found across the network, the ransomware is going to need to fetch that file. All the encryption is going to happen on the infected local machine. Then they're going to need to upload that encrypted file back out to the network file share and delete the original file. This can take a lot of time depending on the size of the environment, the amount of data volumes that it needs to encrypt. For cloud-based services, so cloud-based file shares, encryption can take the amount of time it takes can be variable based on the syncing frequency. So, they can be encrypted locally, but it's going to take until the next cloud sync for those encrypted copies to end up replacing the original copies out on the cloud storage. The last stage is the payday stage. So once encryption's done, the ransomware is going to display some sort of ransom note and demand money from the victim. This can happen in various forms. It can be a pop-up. It can be text-based files. It can be HTML files. Usually it's very explicit. These payday screens usually have, a countdown timer, instructions on how to pay, and then also a predetermined amount of ransom that needs to be paid. So let's talk about detecting ransomware. The first thing is I want to discuss the goal. So if you were to map out, each of these different stages, the potential amount of time that they take, you could identify a window of opportunity where you might be able to disrupt this process. So the goal here is really, this window over on the side to be able to interrupt it during this window. So looking at it, the distribution stage, this is where it's a campaign that's looking to infect the users. Not a whole lot to disrupt there. You could prevent it, educating your users not to click on phishing emails, etc. That's not really disrupting it once it's installed on the system. Looking at the next couple of stages, so infecting the user and establishing persistence, so infection and staging, those happen very, very rapidly. So the likelihood of disrupting malware disrupting ransomware during this stage is fairly low. But when you get to scanning and encryption, depending on the size of the environment that this ransomware is deployed within, this could take minutes or hours. So this is the first real window of opportunity to stop the process of encryption and to stop the spread of infection, especially if you can do it during the scanning phase. So the goal is to be able to identify this ransomware behavior early enough in this life cycle that you can salvage as much as you can of sensitive files. So I suggest using a behavioral approach to detect ransomware. There's a couple of reasons. So one of the things is during our research, of the 86 specimens that we dissected, none of them remained unchanged for more than 24 hours. So the authors of these ransomware are constantly updating their software, which means that signature-based approach is going to be ineffective. The other thing is that, as I said earlier, ransomware has a common goal, and there are common steps that have to happen. You need to find files, you need to encrypt those files, you need to demand money. These things are common to all types of ransomware. So by using a behavioral approach, you can find all sorts of different variants, and you can also future-proof. You can find ransomware that hasn't been written yet or invented yet, because you're looking for the signs of how this behaves in a system. And even WannaCry conforms to this model. So the tool that I suggest for this detection is behavioral analysis, specifically UEBA, or user and entity behavior analysis. The reason is what UEBA does is it's looking to determine how machines and humans normally behave. Typically, these systems ingest logs from all sorts of other systems. So like logs out of your SIM, DLP, alerts from malware, EDR, web proxy, etc. And what they're going to do is associate them all back to users and associate them back all to the relevant humans, to the relevant machines, and figure out how these machines normally work and establish a baseline of operational behavior. From there, it's very easy to find risky and anomalous activity. If you combine that technology with an understanding of how malware normally behaves or how ransomware normally behaves, you can identify it by its activity. So UEBA typically uses machine learning, statistical analysis, and behavioral modeling to perform this baselining. So a little bit in a gross oversimplification of how that works. If we wanted to map out, for instance, a user Barbara and her normal VPN patterns, every time that Barbara VPNs in from somewhere, we can collect that data point. And over time, we're able to build out a data model, like the one over here. We can see that by tracking her past behavior, we can see that for Barbara, it's very normal to connect from the US or Canada or Germany. And slightly abnormal, but still within her baseline to connect from Ukraine. But if she starts to connect from places like China or Brazil, we would be able to understand that this is an anomaly. And by mapping out the behavior of all sorts of data points from different systems, we can have a very good understanding of how, Barbara or some other user or some other entity, some machine normally operates. So the next step is to pair that with different behavior that's indicative of ransomware at different phases. So what I'm going to do is highlight a couple of example behaviors and some sources of data that might be used to find those for each different stage. And this is absolutely not meant to be exhaustive. I just want to give you examples. So at the distribution phase, the goal here is basically to trick users, right? So an example behavior that you might be able to find is an email with an attachment that's coming from a domain that's never sent any emails to anyone in this company before. This alone, it wouldn't be indicative of ransomware, but it's one piece of the puzzle. And to understand this, you need to understand what's normal, what domains normally interact with your organization, and to be able to aggregate that at a company-wide or organizational-wide scale. So a source of data here would be email. Looking at infection, so an example behavior of this phase would be a file has been downloaded and is either renamed or run from an unusual place, like a temporary directory or a cache directory, and this is a new process for the user or for the machine. So you can see an example of that down in the corner. First execution of a process in this directory for this host. To understand this, you need to have an understanding of what is normal operation for both a user and for their machine. What processes do they normally run? Where are those processes normally run from? It's that context of what is normal that allows you to find this behavior. Another example would be a process runs another process and then dissolves itself, right? That in general could be indicative of a very, unusual behavior. Some areas that you might look, or data sources that you might look for these types of behavioral indicators would be file activity or maybe process tracking. Moving into the staging phase, an example behavior here would be a process has not been seen in the enterprise before that creates a randomly named executable, or an executable with the name of a Windows component is run but in a different product path, or a different path. Here you might be looking in things like file activity or process tracking. maybe registry tracking would be a good place to look for this sort of behavior. In the scanning phase, what this is really doing is just looking through the system for sensitive files. So an example behavior might be a process in a temporary location or a process with a known name, but in a new location. It's just enumerating large number of local directories. So you can see this is an example from our product. There were 26 file reads here. So things you might look for are areas to look for. It might be file activity or process tracking. The encryption phase, what we'd be looking for is something like a process reads, creates, and deletes files from an unusual number of directories. So a place to look for that would be file activity or process tracking. And then finally, for the payday phase, an example would be a process is running from an unusual place, spawns a web browser or a notepad with command line arguments. That might be very unusual for specific users. For some users, it may be typical behavior, but that's another artifact that you could look for. And here, file activity or process tracking. So this is again not an exhaustive list, but if you're looking for a more exhaustive list, we do have a white paper, and on the last page of it has a very detailed list of for each stage, what are some example behaviors that you could look for and where you could look for them. So now that we have a tool in our toolbox, we have some idea of what behaviors you could look for, I want to talk about how you can automate response. So the other tool that I suggest using is an automated response platform or a SOAR tool if you're talking to Gartner. These are tools that perform security orchestration and automated response. In essence, you could think about them like middleware. They use APIs to connect to various security and IT infrastructure solutions. So they're going to connect to all of the different systems that you have. And they're able to use those APIs to pull information in, to run actions over those APIs in different systems. And then the goal is to create playbooks, which are strings of different actions that are come together to perform logical tasks like investigation, containment, mitigation, or remediation. A pretty easy to understand example would be like if you wanted to create a playbook to look for phishing, that might be the one on the right over there. You'd want to reach out to an email server at the time of an incident and pull all the emails that the victim received. You want to look and see if any of them had attachments, take those attachments, and then maybe throw them into a sandbox like Cisco Threat Grid, and you're going to detonate them and look for things that are unusual, like risk scores or identify outbound network connections. If there's network connections, you could take those and put them into a DNS tool, geolocate those IP addresses. You could see if you can obtain IP reputation. You might want to pull in logs from a SIM to see who else got these same emails. If you've determined that it's a phishing email, then what you can do is reach out to an email security tool and quarantine those emails. So this is the sort of playbook that you can build. So these two tools, your UEBA solution and your IR automation tool, really become a powerful 1-2 punch for ransomware. The reason is that you can use UEBA for detection and IR for response. And the goal, again, is to be able to detect and to respond during that window of interruption so you can stop the spread of ransomware. Each of these tools brings something unique to the table. On the UEBA side, you have the ability to ingest data from all sorts of systems and holistically analyze it from a behavior point of view. It could be SIM logs, EDR logs, proxy, Active Directory, Windows logs, etc. And then once you have these baselines established, you can perform real-time behavioral analysis to look for these indicators of ransomware. And once you have enough indicators that you can determine this is in fact ransomware, you can ship that out to IR automation to do something about it. And the good news is that as you use UEBA to gather these indicators of compromise, you also have some contextual understanding. Is this a domain that someone else has ever accessed? Is this abnormal behavior for our user? So you have more information to work with from an investigation point of view. And the goal is basically real-time detection of anomalous activity that's indicative of any ransomware, not just known ransomwares. On the IR side, you're basically using API-based integrations with your different IT and security infrastructure to run either semi or fully automated playbooks so that you can respond very, very quickly. And I'll show you what that looks like. When you go to creating a playbook, the first thing to know is that most vendors have out-of-the-box playbooks for a lot of different scenarios. It could be things like, malware or phishing. It could be things like ransomware. So if they don't have an out-of-the-box playbook, most vendors also have the ability to use a playbook editor, so you can wire up all of your different IT or security infrastructure into a logical format of your own playbooks. These playbooks can do things like investigation, containing an incident, mitigating it, and they can also be used to perform IT automation to do prevention, for example. So let's look at a playbook. So this is a very high-level playbook. The reason is that if we were to go down into the weeds, all of these items over here on the right would actually be part of a giant flowchart. It would be very hard for us to zoom in and discuss. But this playbook is assuming that you have both a UEBA tool and you have some sort of IR automation tool. Starting over here, what you've done is your UEBA tool is going to put together enough of these behavioral anomalies that it's determined that ransomware does exist on at least one machine in an environment. Then it's going to send an alert out to your IR automation tool. That IR tool is going to create an incident. Many of these tools, including ours, are context aware. So it'll understand this is a malware incident, this is the playbook I should kick off. This is a ransomware incident, this is the playbook it should kick off. So the first one that I would suggest for ransomware is to have an automated investigation playbook. So by the time that a human logs in and looks at this incident, it should have all of the information necessary to make a deterministic judgment as to what you want to do, what's happening, and what I want to do. To do that, it's going to automatically populate and pull in information from different systems. So from UEBA, it can pull in things like the UEBA session, which will be complete with details. So what was abnormal, what happened in what order. Many of these tools can provide a chronological timeline of how things are unfolding. It can also include what was abnormal about each of the IOCs. So what domains were abnormal and why were they abnormal? What emails and processes were abnormal and what was different about it? And then what IP addresses were unusual or abnormal. It can reach out to an email server. So if this was kicked off via phishing, you can pull in the phishing email and you can parse it for additional IOCs. It can reach out to your EDR solution and obtain a snapshot of the host to identify the suspicious files that are involved, to collect those and then to throw them directly into a sandbox and detonate them. Here you're looking for additional file hashes, additional IOCs. You might be looking to discover additional external domains that are being accessed. So the goal is at this point that all of this up until now is fully automated. No human needs to be involved. And when a human logs in and looks at this incident, they can very quickly see all that information in one place without needing to do anything. And from there, they can determine what needs to be done. Do I want to run an additional playbook because I'm missing key pieces of information? Do I want to run a containment playbook? Is this actually something completely different and I need to run a different playbook? Assuming that this was ransomware, I might want to kick off a containment playbook, which might look like this. So we've already got all sorts of IOCs, and we have context and information from our UEBA tool. And what I might want to do is to reach out to these different systems and take action. So all of this can be automated. Once I click go, it's going to use API calls and reach out to these systems. And in EDR, it might kill the process on affected machines if it's still running. So if you're in the scanning and encryption phase, you might be able to stop it. You could also ban the hash to prevent other systems from being impacted by this same strain of ransomware. It could reach out to the firewall and block IP addresses. You'd be able to do this with a little bit more context because, in UEBA, if you have the ability to say, this is the first time anyone in our organization has ever interacted with this IP address, then you can block it with a little bit more certainty than if you just have a random IP address and you don't know how it's going to impact your system. Same is true for web proxies. You could block domains. Specifically for the WannaCry, you might not want to do this because they have a domain that's used as a kill switch. But for other ransomware, typically speaking, you'd be able to block the domain. For email, if this came in through a phishing email, you might want to quarantine that email. You can also reach out to ticketing systems like Jira or ServiceNow and open up tickets that could do things like, re-image the machine, look for backups that we have available of the data, etc. So the idea is, by using this 1-2 punch, you can basically perform an investigation and have all of the context you need to make judgment calls from UEBA, and then automatically at the click of a button, resolve the situation or contain it or mitigate it or perform further investigation with an IR automation tool. So specific to WannaCry, because it's topical, if you need to prevent it, here are some steps. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that because the point of this wasn't to really talk about WannaCry, but it is important information. Some things that you can do to prevent WannaCry. First and foremost, update all of your systems, specifically Windows-based systems with the latest security patches. Once you have these patches in place, the current strain of WannaCry won't be able to infect those systems. You can ensure detection and blocking of known WannaCry domains, as well as Tor traffic. You can create DNS sinkholes. You'll want to allow WannaCry domains that are known sinkholes to kill the malware. So it does have a built-in kill switch. You can block Tor2 web proxy sites from being accessed. You'll want to audit your firewalls and block SMB protocol ports 139 and 445 for inbound traffic. On EDR, you can set basic alerts for the WannaCry file extensions, so .WNRI and WNCRI files, so that you get an alert when they're created. You can disable network access when that host is triggered. And then ultimately, and this is true not only of WannaCry, but all ransomware, it's very important that you educate your team. Not only what WannaCry looks like, but what other ransomware looks like, how to identify phishing emails, how to understand, if you're venturing into the sketchier parts of the internet, make sure to look at links before you click on them. Basic education can go an awful long way for preventative measures. So that's my last slide. Oh, one more slide. A little bit about us as a company. So what Exabeam is we are the provider of a next generation SIEM. We call that SIEM a security intelligence platform. In essence, what it does is it has solutions that help with detecting, analyzing, and responding to modern threats like ransomware. On the collection side, in essence, what we've done is put together a suite of solutions that allow for unlimited log management without a data volume-based pricing model. So the goal is just get all of your data in one place for a low cost that's predictable so that you can use it for analysis. On the detection side, we have the world's most deployed UEBA solution using behavioral analytics to find complex threats. On the response side, we have an IR automation tool called Incident Responder that allows your security analysts to have effective and efficient response and to basically amplify their ability to respond to incidents in your organization. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A box to ask questions.
Okay, thank you, Orion. We're going to go ahead and look at the Q&A panel. Go ahead and put your questions in there and we'll answer them as they come in. So let's start with our first question. Orion, what do you see as the future for ransomware?
So I alluded to it earlier in the presentation, but I think that ransomware is going to carry on down the path of WannaCry, that being leaning more towards exploits than social engineering, and then also seeing a lot more ransomware or like self-propagating versions of ransomware.
Okay, let's see, next question here. You didn't talk much about how to get your files back.
True. I guess most of the aim of this presentation was to talk about detection and response, not necessarily about recovery. But in general, there are some things that you can do. People should be backing up your files. That lets you retrieve them even if you're hit with ransomware. And a good kind of rule of thumb is to remember the 3-2-1 rule. So create 3 backup copies on 2 different types of media and have 1 backup that's in a separate location. So even if you have this ransom worm type of scenario, you've got a backup that's elsewhere that may be isolated from the network.
Okay. The next question is from Brian. What about mobile? Are mobile devices safe from ransomware?
No, absolutely not. So there are mobile-specific versions of ransomware. A famous one is S-Locker, which stands for Frantic Locker, which is an Android version of malware, version of ransomware. Has about 1,000 different variants.
Okay. Chris is asking, you didn't spend much time on preventing ransomware.
Yeah, again, I talked a little bit about it through the frame of reference of WannaCry, but, first and foremost, make sure that you're backing things up, use the 3-2-1 rule, Patching is very, very important, making sure that you're running up-to-date versions of software. So, if you patch your systems right now up to the most recent version of Windows, then WannaCry is not an issue. And then education. So, teach your team how to not click on sketchy links, how to, understand if this is a phishing email or not. Those go a long way.
Okay. Looks like this is the final question coming in. If you guys have some more, go ahead and submit them. This attendee is asking, lots of vendors claim to be able to handle ransomware. What's different about this solution?
I think really what's different about this is it's using two relatively new technologies. So UEBA has been around for a few years, and then IR automation, also relatively new technology. It allows you to detect based on behavior instead of signatures, and then also to respond very, very, very quickly.
Okay, and we have another question from Peter. Can ransomware encrypt where you only have read access to the files, like worm storage?
So I can't speak to worm storage specifically, but it's my understanding that ransomware would need to have write and delete access to really complete its goal. Just having read access is going to allow it to read the data, but it's not going to be able to get rid of it and to replace it with an encrypted file.
Okay, we're going to pause for a second just to make sure we have time for any other questions that want to come through. Okay, looks like we have covered all of our questions. Ryan, do you have anything else you would like to add before we wrap up?
I do. One quick thing, which I forgot to mention, which is, in essence, and I guess going back to how to get your files back, that question, in general, it's not a good idea to pay the ransom. Oftentimes, it works, but it's kind of encouraging hackers to continue to, develop ransomware and to, you're kind of furthering the enemy's cause. But additionally, there's no guarantee that you're going to get your files back. There's been numerous, highly public events where people have had to pay the ransom many, many times before they got their files back. Additionally, oftentimes, decryption software becomes available for free on the internet after a couple of months. So I don't suggest paying ransom.
Okay. Thank you for the great discussion, and thanks to all of you for joining us today.